All right, welcome. Today, we're stepping into the ring with some of the absolute heavyweights of Christian thought. We're going to tackle the big ones, the questions that have echoed for centuries. What is God really like? Where do we fit in? And how does this whole story end? Believe me, this isn't just some dusty old history lesson. These ideas are alive and kicking right now.
So here is the plan for our deep dive today. First, we'll look at the nature of God himself. Then we'll zoom in on humanity, on us. After that, we'll get into the fate of Israel, which is a huge one. Then, the end of the world, the final battle, and we'll wrap it all up by trying to make sense of the very, very complicated legacy these thinkers left behind.
Okay, first up, the biggest question of all. God. Is God an angry judge, just kind of tapping his fingers waiting for us to mess up? Or is God a creative force that's holding everything together? The answers we're about to see, well, they couldn't be further apart. But before we get into what they thought, let me ask you, what's your gut reaction? What do you see? Because honestly, how you answer that question changes everything. It sets the whole tone. Is it a feeling of dread, or is it a feeling of pure wonder? And here we go. This is the image that made Jonathan Edwards a household name. It's from his sermon in 1741, and whoa, is it intense. He's painting a picture of a God who is constantly, actively holding himself back from just letting you drop into hell. It's not a possibility, it's the default setting, and only God's hand is stopping it. Now, let's hit rewind, way back 500 years before Edwards, to Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas was a philosopher, a deep thinker, and he came at this question from a totally different angle, not with terrifying images, but with logic and reason. And his conclusion about God? It's going to sound radically different. You know, this is such a powerful way to put it. Bishop Robert Barron explains that for Aquinas, God isn't just another big, powerful thing in the universe competing with us. No, God is the very fabric of existence. The burning bush from the Bible, that's the perfect metaphor. God's presence doesn't burn things up or destroy them. It makes them more alive, more vibrant, more themselves. So you see the clash here, right? It's huge. Is God's power a threat that has to be held back like a dam about to burst? Or is God's power the very thing that allows anything to exist in the first place? One view puts you on the edge of a cliff forever. The other puts you at the very center of what it means to be. So, if that's God, then what about us? How does your view of God change how you see yourself? This is our next big question. Because depending on which vision of God you follow, our fate as human beings, as sinners, looks completely different. Edwards just doubles down on that spider image, doesn't he? He's basically saying we're already falling. Our sin is like this immense gravity, this weight that's pulling us down into the abyss. So in his mind, God isn't pushing you. He's the only one holding you up. And the truly shocking thing is that his sovereign pleasure decides to do that for even one more second. Okay, let's bring another voice into the mix. This is the Prince of Preachers himself, Charles Spurgeon, from 19th century London. He was an absolute powerhouse in the pulpit. In Spurgeon, he shifts the focus. For him, it's less about God holding you back and way, way more about the urgent choice that you have to make. Man, Spurgeon does not mess around. For him, there's no middle ground, no gray area. He talks about people trying to be half horse, half alligator, and he's got no time for it. You are on one team or the other. It's not about being passively dangled over a fire, it's about actively choosing who your boss is. It's a binary choice and everything hangs on it. All right, we are now wading into waters that have shaped not just theology, but actual world history for 2,000 years. The question is, after Jesus, what's God's plan for the Jewish people? For a long, long time, many Christians thought the church had just replaced Israel. But what's so fascinating is that the thinkers we're looking at, they saw things very differently. Think about this. Thomas Aquinas, writing way back in the 1200s, looked at the Bible and said, hold on, God's not done with Israel. He actually believed that sometime in the future, there would be this moment of universal salvation for the Jewish people. That was not a common view at the time. And now get this. Here's this amazing point of agreement. 500 years later, Jonathan Edwards, preaching in colonial America, comes to the exact same conclusion. He stood up and said it was very clear from the Bible that the Jewish people would one day be restored to their homeland. Just an incredible, unexpected overlap of thought across the centuries. Okay, so if that's the story for Israel,
what about the story for the whole world? Let's talk about the end game, the grand finale, eschatology. How did these theologians imagine history would finally wrap up?
So Edwards had this view of the end times that was, well, surprisingly optimistic. It's called post-millennialism. He believed that the world would actually get better and better as Christianity spread. He saw all of history as this long war against what he called two great anti-Christian kingdoms, the papacy in the West and Islam in the East. For him, the Reformation was the turning point that would eventually lead to a golden age of peace on earth before Jesus came back for the final judgment. And Charles Spurgeon, he shares this vision of total victory, but he says it with so much more drama. You can just hear him booming this from the pulpit, right? He pictures this future moment, looking back and asking, where are all the enemies of God? And the answer is just total silence. They're gone, vanished, sunk like a stone into the sea. Game over.
We've seen all these powerful and often clashing ideas, but what about the men themselves? How are we supposed to think about them? To figure that out, we're going to use Jonathan Edwards as our main case study because his legacy is, well, it's a real tangled mess. Okay, look at this. The picture of Edwards is just full of contradictions. Scholars today point out he actually preached way more about the beauty of God than he ever did about hell. But guess which one he's remembered for? He owned slaves and used the Bible to justify it. Yet his own son took his dad's ethical writings and used them to argue against slavery. It's just so much messier than someone like Aquinas, who's the common doctor, or Spurgeon, the prince of preachers. Edwards forces you to look at a much more complicated reality. And yet, this was also a man of intense, deeply personal discipline. He wrote out a list of 70 resolutions to guide his own life, things he read every single week, vowing to live with all his might for the glory of God. So this wasn't just abstract ideas for him. He took his own inner life incredibly seriously. And this really leaves us with the final and maybe the most important question. It's one thing to debate ideas, but it's another thing entirely to grapple with the flawed, complicated people who had them. So how do we do it? How do we learn from someone's brilliance while also condemning their moral blind spots? It's a tough one, and it's a challenge that forces us to think not just about them, but about ourselves and about the kind of legacy we're going to leave behind.